Are you perishing? This may sound like a rather macabre way to begin, but I believe that it's an important question for us to discern and discuss as Christians. It's especially important to consider this question as we journey through the season of Lent. You probably don't have to consider the question long before you come to the honest conclusion that, without a doubt, the answer is yes. I'm perishing. This becomes all the more poignant the older we get. As we become weaker, it definitely becomes far more difficult for us to fool ourselves that we're in control. The conclusion becomes quite clear. I am frail and weak and mortal. This reality is driven home especially on Ash Wednesday. There, we consider the words of God from Genesis chapter 3, verse 19. Following Adam and Eve's fall into sin where they disobeyed God, death would be chief among the consequences they would face. God puts it this way in Genesis chapter 3:19, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. The ashes then are symbolic of the consequence of sin. We perish and die. Wow, that's pretty heavy stuff, right? It is without a doubt, which is why it's important this Lent to focus on God and His promises and what He specifically says about a life of ashes, because He has a word for those who are perishing. There's a great text that's easily overlooked that talks about the perishing life. It's from Deuteronomy 26, verse 5. The context of this verse is God preparing Israel to enter into the land that He has promised to give them. Verse 5 is the first verse of the confession that Israel is called to make as they offer the first fruits of their crops, which would be a gift that God has given them. This confession then would be a confession of the wonderful work of God on their behalf. It would be about His faithfulness and deliverance for them. And it begins in this way, and you shall make response before the Lord your God. A wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number. This verse is describing Jacob and his family when they initially made their way to Egypt at the end of the book of Genesis. Did you notice how Jacob was described? Many translations refer to him as a wandering Aramean. However, I would contend that the word perishing is a better fit here. The English word wandering here comes from the Hebrew word avad, which means, depending on its usage, to destroy, become lost, go astray, and perish. But think about who Jacob is when he goes down to Egypt. At that point in his life, he's 130 years old. He's portrayed as mortal, weak, perishing, despised by society, and what's more, that's who God chooses. The same idea is emphasized also in verse 5 in regards to Israel. All the descendants of Jacob who went down with him to Egypt were said to be few in number. Exodus tells us they were 70 in all. But again, few in number doesn't quite get to it here either. Rather than few in number, they too were perishing, mortal, weak, dying, fragile people. This brings us to the main point. What does God do with such perishing and fragile people? What God does for perishing Jacob and small Israel tells us about the heart God has for His people. If you're anything like me, you probably lose count of the number of times each day you feel like you're perishing, like you're as small and low as the dust. Our mistakes haunt us, our weaknesses and pain afflict us. The Apostle Paul answers the question that Deuteronomy begins. In Romans 7:24, Paul cries out, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" Answer, Romans 7:25. Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. Ashes wasn't the end for Israel. Their confession goes on to echo God's deeds of salvation. He delivered them with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. He has a heart for His people. He hears your cries and knows your pain. He sends Jesus, as Paul emphasizes, for us in the midst of our ashes. With His mighty outstretched arms on the cross, you are delivered. You see, the ashes also remind us of that also. The ashes of Ash Wednesday are placed upon our forehead in the shape of a cross, as a reminder that sin does not have the last word. God has sent His Son to destroy sin, death, and the devil, bringing us everlasting life through His cross and resurrection. But until the last day, when God will raise us bodily from the grave, we live with the reality of ashes, but not without hope. Even now, we reside safely in the arms of Christ. Moses himself puts it this way in Deuteronomy 33:27. The eternal God is your dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. That's our Thursday theological thought for this week. I thank you so much for joining me. Christ's peace be with you.